Hi friends, continuing to the chapter The World Without Us. The New York Botanical Garden, located on 250 acres across from the Bronx Zoo, possesses the largest herbarium anywhere outside of Europe. Among its treasure are wildflowers, specimens gathered on Captain Cook's in 1769, Pacific wanderings, and a sherd of mosses from Terra del Fuego, with the accompanying notes written in a watery blank ink and signed by its collector C. Darwin. Most remarkable thought is the NYBGS 40 acres tract of original, old growth, virgin New York forest, never logged, never cut but mightily changed. Until only recently it was known as the hemlock forest for its shady stance of that graceful conifer. But almost every hemlock here is now dead, slain by a Japanese insects smaller than the period at the end of this sentence, which arrived in New York in the mid 1980s. The oldest and the biggest oaks, dating back to the when this forest was British, are also crashing down, their vigor sapped by acid rain and heavy metals such as lead from the automobile and factory fumes, which has soaked into the soil. It's unlikely that they will come back, because most camphor trees here long ago stopped regenerating. Every residential native species now harbors its own pathogen. Some fungus, insects, or the diseases that seize that opportunity to the ravished trees weakened by chemicals outslack, as if they weren't enough, as the NYBGS forest became an island of greenery surrounded by hundreds of square miles of a grey urbanity. It became the primary refuge for Bronx squirrel. With nature predators gone and no hunting permitted, there is nothing to stop them from devouring every acorn or hickory nuts before it can be germinate, which they do. There is now an 8-decade gap in this old forest and story. Instead of new generation of a native oaks, maple, ash, birch, sycamore and tulip trees, what is mainly growing are imported ornamental that have blown in from the rest of the Bronx. Soil saplings indicates some 20 million Alindaceous seeds sprouting here. According to the Chuck Peter, curators of the NYBS Institute of Economical Botany, exhaust such as Ailanthus and the croc trees, both from China, now account for more than a quarter of this forest. Some people want to put the forest back the way it was 200 years ago. He says, to do that, I will tell you, you have got to put the Bronx back the way it was 200 years ago. As human beings learned to transport themselves all over the world, they took life things with them and brought back others. Plants from the American changed not only ecosystems in European countries, but also there was identities. Think of an Ireland before potatoes or Italy before tomatoes in the opposite direction. Old world invaders not only forced themselves on hapless women of Vaniquid's new lands, but broadcast other kinds of seeds beginning with the wheat, barley, and rye. In a phrase coined by the American geographer Alfred, this ecological information helped European conquerors to permanently stamp their images on their colonies. Some results were ludicrous, like English garden with hyacinths and daffodils, that never quite took hold in the colonial Indian. In the New York, the European sterling, now a ubiquitous avian pest from Alaska to Mexico, was introduced because someone thought that the city would be more cultured in the Central Park, were home to each bird mentioned in Shakespeare. Next came a Central Park garden with every plant in the Brad's play, sown with the lyrical likes of primroses, wormwooks, larkhill, eglantine, and the cowslips, everything short of Macbell's Birman wood. To what extent did the Mahatma project's virtual past resembles the Mahatma's forest to come depends on a struggle for North American soil that will continue long after the human that instigated it are going. The NYBS herbarium also holds one of the first American species of a despectively lovely lavender stalk. The seeds of the purple loosestrife, native to the northeast from Britain to Finland, likely arrived in a wet sand that the merchant ship dug from the European tidal floods as a ballast for the Atlantic crossings. As trade with the collisions grew, more purple loosestrife was dumped along American shores as a ship jettisoned blasts before taking on cargo. Once established, it's moved up streams and rivers as its streets stuck to the muddy features or fur of the whatever it touched. In Dustin River wetland, communities of a cattail, willow, and a granny grass that fed unsheltered waterfall and mustard turn into the solid curtains of a purple, implemental even to the wildlife. By the 21st century, the purple loosestrifes was at a large even in Alaska, where panic stage ecologists fear it will fill entire marshes, driving out the ducks, geese, terns, and swans. Even before the Shakespeare's garden, Central Park designs, Olmsted, and the Wax had brought in a 500,000 trees along with their 500,000 cubic yards of fills to complete their improved vision of the nature, spicing up the island with an exotic like Persian ironwood, Asian katsuras, cedars of Lebanon, and Chinese or royal paulans and jacobs. Yet, once humans are gone, the native plants left to complete with a formidable contingent of alien species in order to reclaim their birthright will have some ground advantages. Many foreign ornaments, double roses for example, will wither with the civilization that introduced them because they are sterile hybrids that must propagate through cuttings. When the gardeners that clown them go, so do they. Other pampered colonial like English ivory left to the fend for themselves, lost to their rough American cousins, Virginia creepers and poison ivy. Still, others are really mutations forced by the highly selective breedings. If they survey at all, their forms and the presence will be diminished. untended fruits such as apples and imported from Russia and Kazakhstan, belaying the American Johnny Apple's myth, select for hardiness, not appearance, not taste, and turn glandular. Expect for a few survivors, unsprayed apple orchards, defenseless against their Native American curses, apple megaphits, and the leaf miner blitz will be reclaimed by the native hardwoods. Introduced garden plots, vegetables will revert to the humble beginnings. Sweet carrots, originally Asian, quickly devote to the wild, unpalatable Queen Anne's lace as animals devour the last of the tasty orange one we planted, says the New York Botanical Garden Vice President Dennis Stevenson. Broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and the cauliflower, regrets to some, unrecognizable broccoli's ancestors. Descending of the seeds corn planted by the Dominicans in Washington Heights, Parkway Medians may eventually retrace their DNA back to the original Mexican tennis toy, its cob barely bigger than a sprig of a wheat. The other invasions that has accosted natives, metals such as lead, mercury, and cadmium will not vanish quickly from the soil because these are literally heavy molecules. One thing is certain, when cars have stopped for goods and the factories goes dark and stay that way, no more such metals will be deposited. For the first 100 years or so, however, Croatians with periodically set off time bombs left in the petroleum tanks, chemicals, and the power plants, and the hundreds of the dry cleaners. Gradually, bacteria will feed on the residue of a fuel, laundry solvents, and lubricants, reducing them to more being organic hydrocarbons. Although a whole spectrum of man-made novelties ranging from the certain pesticides to the plastiers to the insulators will linger for millennia until microbes evolve to process them. Yet with each new acid-free rainfall, trees that still endure will have fewer contaminated to rustics as the chemicals are gradually flushed from the system. Over centuries, vegetations will take up a decreasing level of heavy metals and will recycle, redeposit, and dilute them further. As plants die, decay, and lay down more soil cover, the industrial toxins will be buried deeper, and each succeeding crop of a native seedlings will do better. And although many of the New York's heirloom trees are endangered, if not actually dying, few, if any, are already existent. Even the deeply gnawed American chestnuts devastated everywhere after a fungal blight entered New York around 1900s in a shipment of an Asian nursery plants still hangs on in the New York's Botanical Gardens old forest, literally by its roots. It sprouts, sends up skinny shoots to height, gets knocked back by the blitz, and does it again. One day, perhaps with no human stress sapping its vigor, a resistant strains will finally emerge. Once the tallest hardwood in the American eastern forest, the resecured chestnut trees will have to coexist with the robust non-natives that are probably here to say Japanese, Barbary, Oriental, bittersweets and surely ailanthus. The ecosystem here will be a human aircraft that will persist in our absence, a cosmopolitan botanical mixtures that would never have occurred without us. Which may not be bad, suggested the New York Botanical Garden Chuck Peter. What makes New York a great city now in its cultural diversity? Everyone has something to offer, but botanically we're exophobic. We love nature specific and want aggressive, exotic plants species to go home. He props his running shoes against the whist bark of the China armor croc trees growing among the lost of the hemlocks. This may sound blasphemous, but maintained by biodiversity is less important than maintaining a functional ecosystem. What matters is that the soil is protected, that water get cleaned, that trees filters the air, that a canopy regenerated new seedlings to keep nutrients from draining away into the Bronx River. He inhales a lungful of filtered Bronx air, trim and youthful in his early 50s. Peters has spent much of his life in the forest. His field research has revealed that pocket of a wild palm nut trees in the Amazon or a durian fruit trees in a virgin brownie or of a tea tree in Burma's jungles aren't accidents. Once humans were there too, the wilderness swallowed them and their memory, but its shapes still bears their echo, as will this one. In fact, it has done so since soon after Homo sapiens appeared here. Eric's Sanderson Mahadanta project is recreating the islands as the Dutch found it. Not some primordial Mahadanta's forest no human had set foot on, because there wasn't one. Because before the Lenin arrived, explains Sanderson's, nothing was here except for a mile thick slab of ice. About 11,000 years ago, as the last ice age receded northwards from the Mahadan, it pulled along the spruce and tamarack taiga that today grows just below the Canadian. In this place came what we know as the temperature eastern forest of North America: oak, hickory, chestnuts, walnuts, hemlocks, elm, beech, sugar maple, sweet gum, and the wild filberts. In the clearing grew shrubs of the cork cherry, fragrant sumac, honeysuckles, and assorted ferns and the flowering plants. Spartinia and the rose mallows appeared in the salt marshes. As all this foliage filled these warning niches, warm-blooded animals followed, including humans. A death of a archaeological remains suggested that the first New Yorks probably didn't settle, but camped seasonally to pick the berries, chestnuts, and the wild grapes. They hunted turkey, heath, hens, ducks, and the white-tailed deers, but mainly they fished. The surrounding waters, swards, with smell ducts and hearings. Brook trout ran in Mahadanda streams, oysters, clams, crabs, and the lobsters were so abundant that harvesting them was effortless. Large maidens of discarded mollusks shells along the shores were the first human structures here. By the time Henry Hudson first saw the island, Upper Herman and Greenwich village was grassy savannas cleared repeatedly with fire by the Lenni for planting. By flooding Asians, Helm fit pits to see that what floats to the top. Maharanta's projects, researchers have learned that the Lenni cultivated the corn, bean, squash and the sunflowers. Much of the islands was still as green as and dense as that of Puzzasa, but well before its famous transformation from the Indian land to the colonial real estate, priced to sell at 60 Dutch gliders, the mark of Homo sapiens was already on Manhattan. In the Millennium Year 2000, a harbinger of a future that might rebuke the past appeared in the form of a coyote that managed to reach the Central Park. Subsequently, two more made it into the town, as well as a wild turkey. The rewilding of the New York City may not until wait people leave. That first advance coyote Scots arrived via the George Washington Bridge with Jerry Teltafo, managed for the port authorities of the New York and New Jersey. Later, he took over the bridges that links the Staten Island to the mainland and the Long Island. A structural engineer in his 40s, he considered bridges among the loveliest ideas humans ever convinced, gracefully spanning chasm to bring people together. Del Tafo himself spanned an ocean. His olive features bespeaks slightly. His voice is pure urban New Jersey, bred to the pavement and the steel that became his life's work. He nonetheless marvels at the annual miracles of a baby falcons hatching high atop the George Washington Towers, and at the sheer botanical of grass, weeds, and the trees that valiantly bloom far from the topsoils, for metal niches suspended high above the water. His bridges are under a constant guerrilla assist by the nature. Its arsenal and the troops may seem ludicrously funny against the steel-plated armor, but to ignore the endless, ubiquitous bird dropping that can snag and sprout the airborne seeds and simultaneously dissolve paints would be the fatal. Del Tufa is up against a primitive but unrelenting foe whose ultimate strength is its ability to outlast its adversary, and he accepts as a fact that the ultimately nature must win. Not on his watch though, if he can help it. First and the foremost, he honors the legacy he and his crew inherit. Their bridges was built by the generation of the engineers who couldn't possibly have convinced of a third of a million cars crossing them daily. Yet 80 years later, they are still in the service. Our job, he tells these men, is to hand over these treasures to the next generation is better shaped them when we accepted them. On a February afternoon, he heads through snow flurries to the Bayonne Bridge. Chanting with his crew over his radio, the underside of the approach on the Staten Island side is a powerful steel matrix that converged in a huge concrete block anchored to the bedrock, and abundant that bears half the load of the Bayonne's main span. To stand up directly into its load bearing I-beam and bracking members interlocked with half-inch thick steel plates, flangels, and several millions half-inch rifts and the bolts recalls the crushing awe that humbles pilgrim gazing at the soaring Vatican dome of St. Peter's Cathedral. Some thinks this mighty is here forever, yet Jerry Del Taffo knows exactly how these bridges without humans to defend to them would come down. It wouldn't happen immediately because the most immediate threat will disappear with us. It is not, says the Del Taffo, the incessant pounding traffics. These bridges are so overbuilt, traffic like an ant on an elephant. In the 1930s, with no computers to precisely calculate tolerance of the construction materials, caution engineers simply headed on excess masses and redundancy. We are living off the overcapacity of our forefathers. The GW alone has enough glavished steel wires in its 3-inch main cables to wrap the earth 4 times, even if every other suspenders rope detoured us, the bridge wouldn't fall down. Enemy number 1 is the salt that highways departments spread on the roadways each winter. The snuffs that keeps eating steels once it's done with the ice. Oil, antifreeze, and the snow melts dripping from the cars washes salts into the catch basins and crevices where maintenance crews were fine at flush it. With no more people, there won't be salt. There will be, however, be rust and a quiet bit of it. When no one is painting the bridges, at first oxidization forms a coating on steel plates twice as thick as more as the metal itself, which slows the pace of the chemical attacks. For steel to the completely rust through and the fall apart might take centuries, but it won't be necessarily to wait that long for New York's bridges to start dropping. The reason is a metallic version of the freeze thaw drama. Rather than a crack like a concrete, steel expands when it warms and contracts when it cools, so that the steel bridges can actually get longer in the summer. They need expansion joints. In the winter, when they shrinks, the space inside the expansion joints opens wider and stuff blow in. Whenever it does, there is less room for the bridges to expand when things warm up. With no one painting bridges, joints fill not only with the debris but also with the rust, which swells to occupy far more spaces than the original metals. Come summer, says Delph Taffo, the bridge is going to get bigger, whatever you like it or not. If the expansion joint is clogged, it expands forward the weakest link. Like where two different materials connect, he points where 4 lanes of steel meets the concrete abundant. There, for an example, the concrete couldn't crack where the beam is bolted to the pier, or after a few sessions, that bolts could shear off. Eventually, the beam could walk itself right off and fall. Every connection is vulnerable. Rust that forms between the two steel plates bolted together erects forces so extreme that either the plates blend or rivets pop, say Del Taffo. Arch bridges like the Bayonne or the Hell Gates over the East River, made to hold railroads, are the most overbuilt of all. They might hold for the next 1,000 years, although earthquake ripple through one of the several faults under the coastal plain could shorten that period. They would probably do better than 14 steel linked concrete subways tubes beneath the East River, one of which, leading to the Brooklands, dated back to the horses and the buggies. Should any of their sections separates, the Atlantic Ocean would rush in. The suspension and the truss bridges that carry automobiles, however, will last only 2 or 3 centuries before the rivets and the ball fails and the entire sections fall into the watering water. Until then, more cyclops follow the footsteps of the interpiered one that managed to reach Central Park D, bears and finally wolves, which have re-entered New England from Canada, arrived in turn. By the time most of its bridges are gone, Mahadanda's New Year building have also been ravaged, as whatever leaked reached their embedded steel reinforced bars, they rust, expanded and burst the concrete that sheathed them. Older stone buildings such as Grand Central, especially with no more acid rain to poke their marbles, will overlast every shiny modern box. Ruins of a high-rise echo the long song of the frogs, breedings in Mahadanta's reconstruction streams, now stocked with alewives and the muzzle drops by seagulls. Hearing and shats have returned to Hudson through they spent some generations adjusting to the radioactivity trickling out of Indian Port nuclear plant, 35 miles north of Times Square, after it reinforced concrete stumbled. Missing, however, are nearly all the faunas adapted to us. The seemingly inevitable cockroach, a tropical import, long ago froze in an unheated apartment buildings. Without garbage, rest starved or became lunch for the raptors nesting in burnt out skyscrapers. Rising waters, tides and the salt corrosions have replaced the engineerized shorelines circling New York's 5 broth within estuaries and small beaches. With no dreading, Central Park spawns and receivers have been reincarnated as marshes, without natural grazers unless horses used by the Hanson's cabs and by the park policemen manage to go to the feral and breed. Central Park grass is gone. A maturing forest is in place, radiating down former streets and invading empty foundations. Coyotes, wolves, red foxes and the bobcats have brought squirrels back into the balance with the oak trees, though enough to outlast the lead we deposited. And after 500 years, even in warming climate, the oaks, beeches and the moisture-loving species such as ash dominates. Long before the wild predators finished off the last Dickens of pet dogs, but a wily population of feral house cats persist feeding on starlings. With brides finely down, tunnels flooded, and Mahahantans truly an islands again. Moose and the bears swim in a widened Hamland river to feast on the berries that the Leneif once picked. Amid the rubble of a Mahadanta's financial institution that literally collapsed for the good, a few banker vaults stand. The money within, however worthless, is wildered but safe. Not so to the artwork stored in the museum vassals, built more for the climate control that strength. Without electricity, protection ceases. Eventually, museum roofs spring leaks, usually starting with their skylights, and their basement fills with standing water. Subjected to the wind, swings in humidity, and the temperature, everything in the storage room is prey to the mold, bacteria, and the vigorous larvae of a nourishing museum scars the black carbet beetle. As they spread to the other floors, fungi discolor and the dissolved painting in the metropolitan beyond recognition. Ceramics, however, are doing fine since they have chemically similar to the fossils. Unless something falls on the first, they await reputerial for the next archaeological to dig them up. Corrosions had thickened the Panatina on a Bronze status but hasn't affected their shapes. That's why we know about the Bronze Age, notes Mahadantan's art converser Barbaria Appelin. Even in the Statue of Liberty ends up at the bottom of the harbor. Its forms will remain intact independently, albeit somewhat chemically altered and possibly enchased in barklands. That might be the safest place for it, because at some point, thousands of the years hence, stone walls still standing, maybe chunks of St. Paul's Chapel across from the World Trade Center, built in 1766 from Mahanta's own heart Shinth, must finally fall. 3 times in the past 100,000 years, galleries has been scrapped New York's clean, unless humankind's fascinating affair with the carbon fuels ended up with tipping the atmosphere past the point of no return and run away the global warming transfigures Earth into Venus at some unknown date. Glaciers would do so again. The mature beech oak ash forest will be mopped down. The 4 giant mountains of entombed garbages at the Fresh Kills landfill on the Staten Island will be flattened. Their vast accumulation of a stubborn PVC plastics and one of the most durable human creations of all, the glass ground to the powder. After the ice recedes, buried in a moraine and eventually in the geographical layer below will be unnatural concentration of a reddish metal, which briefly has assumed the form of wiring and plumbing. Then it was halted to the numb and returned to the earth. The next tool maker to arrive or evolve on this planet might discover and use it. By the by, then there would be nothing to indicate that it was us who put it there. For more than 1 billion years, a sheet of ice has been sliding back and forth from the poles, sometime actually meeting at the equator. The reason involved continental drift, the Earth mildly energetic orbit its wobbly axis and swings its atmosphere carbon dioxide. For the last few million years, with the continent basically where we found them today, ice ages have reassured fair regularly and lasted upwards of 100,000 years, with intervening thaws averaging 12,000 to 28,000 years. The last glacier left New York 11,000 years ago. Under normal conditions, the next to the flattened Mahadantans would be due any day now, though there is a growing doubt that it will arrive on schedule. Many scientists now guess that the current intermission before the next frigid act will last longer because we have managed to postpone the inevitable by snuffing our atmospheric fluid with extra illusions. Comparisons to the ancient bubbles in the American ice core reveals there more than CTO floating around the today than at the time in the past 65,000 years ago. If the people ceases to visit or exist tomorrow, and we have never seen another carbon bearing molecule skywalks. But whatever we have already set in the motion must still pay itself out. That won't happen quickly, but our standards, although our standards are changing because we are Homo sapiens, didn't bother to wait until fossilizations to enter the geological time. By becoming a vertebrate forces of nature, we all have already done so. Among the human crafted artifact that will last the longest after we are gone is our redesigned atmosphere. Thus, Tyler Wolff find nothing strangers about being an architect teaching atmosphere physics and marine chemistry on the New York University biological faculty. He finds he must draw on all those disciplines to describe how humans have turned the atmosphere, biosphere and the briny deep into something that until now only volcanoes and colliding continents plates have been able to achieve. Volk is a lanky man with an wavy dark hair, an eye that's crunched into a crescent when he ponders. Leaning back in his chair, he studied a poster that nearly fills his office bulletin board. It portrays atmosphere and the oceans as a single fluid with layers of deepening density. Until about 200 years ago, carbon dioxide from the gaseous part above the dissolved into the liquid part below at a steady rate that keeps the world at equilibrium. Now, with the atmosphere CO2 level is so high, the ocean need to be readjusted. But because it is so big, he says that takes time. Says there are no more people burying fuel. At first, the ocean surface will absorb CO2 rapidly. As it saturates that slope, it loses some CO2 to photosynthesis organization. Slowly, as the seas mixes, it shrinks and ancient unsaturated water rises from the depth to replace it. It takes 1,000 years for the ocean to completely turn over, but that doesn't bring the earth back to the pre-industrial purity. Ocean and the atmosphere are more in the balance with each others, but both are still superchanged with CO2. So is the land, where excess carbon dioxide will cycle through the soil and life forms that absorbs but eventually release it. So where can it go? Normally, says the old. The biographer is like an upside down glass jar. On top, it basically closes to any extra matters, except for letting in a few meteoroids. At the bottom, the lid is slightly open to the volcanoes. The problem is, by trapping the Carboniferous formation and speeding it up into the sky, we have become a volcano that hasn't stopped erupting since the 1700s. So next the earth must do what it always does when volcanoes throw extra carbon into the system. The rock cycle kicks in, but it is much longer. Silicates such as feldspar and the quartz, which compromises most of the earth crust, are gradually weathered by a carbonic acid formed by the rain and the carbon dioxide and turned to carbonates. Carbonic acids dissolves soil and minerals that releases calcium to the groundwater. Rivers carries this to the sea, where it is precipitated out as a she cells. It is a slow process, sped slightly by the intensity feed weathers in the superchanged atmosphere. Eventually, the world concludes the geological cycle will take CO2 back to pre-human levels. Then will take about 100,000 years or longer. One concern is that even as the tiny sea creatures are locking carbon up in their armor, increased CO2 in the oceans, upper layers may be dissolving their cells. Another is that the more ocean warm, the less CO2 they absorb. As higher temperature inhibit growth of CO2 breathing planktons. Still, old beliefs with us gone the oceans. Initial 1,000 years turnover could absorb as much as 90% of the excess carbon dioxide, leaving the atmosphere with only about 10 to 20 extra parts per million of CO2s above the 280 ppm pre-industrial levels. The difference between that and the today's 380 ppm, scientists who have been spent decades coring the Antarctic ice assures us mean that there will be no enduring glaciers for at least the next 15,000 years. During the time that the extra carbon is being slowly stopped up, however, palmettos and the Mongolians may be repopulating New York City faster than oaks and beeches. The mongoose may have to seek the gooseberries and the elderberries in the Labrador, while Mahadans instead host the likes of armadillos advancing from the south. Unless responds some equally eminent scientists who have been eyeing the Arctic, fresh melt water from the Greenland ice caps chills the Gulf Stream to the halt. Closing down the great ocean conveyor belt, the circulates warm water around the globe. That would bring an iceberg back to the Europe and the east coast of North America after all. Maybe not severe enough to trigger massive sheet glaciers, but treeless tundras and permafrost could become the alternative to temperature forest. The berry bushes would be reduced to stunned, colorful spots of the ground covered among the reindeer lynches, attracting Carberia southwards. In a third wishful scenario, the two extremes might blunt each other's enough to the whole atmosphere suspended in between. Whichever it is, hot or cold or betwixt, in a world where the human stayed around and pushed atmosphere carbon to 500 to 600 parts per million, or the projected 900 ppm by the AD 2100, if we change nothing from the way we do business today. Much of what only lay frozen atop Greenland will be sloshing in a swollen Atlantica, depending on exactly how much of it and the Antarctica go. Mahadandas might become no more than a few islets. One where the great hill once rose above the Central Park, another on outcropping of the slits in the Washington Heights. For a while, clutches of a building a few miles to go, the South would vainly scan the surrounding waters like surfacing, periscopic, until battering waves brought them down. Had humans never evolved, how might the plants have fared? Or was it inevitable that we did? And if we disappeared, would or could we or something equally complicated happens again? Far from either pole, East African Lake Tanganyika lies in a crack that 15 miles years ago began to split Africa into two. The Great African Rift Valley is a continuation of a tectonic parting of the base that began even earlier in what is now Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, that runs south to form a course of Jordan River and the Dead Sea. Then it wandered into the Red Sea and now branching down two parallel cleavages through the crust of Africa. The lake Tanganyika fills a rift western fork for 420 miles, making it the longest lake in the world. Nearly a mile from surface to the bottom, around 10 million years old, it is also the world's second deepest and the second oldest after Siberia's Lake Baikal. That makes it extremely interesting to the scientists who have been extracting core samples of the lake bed sediments. Just as an annual snowfall preserves a history of a climate in the glaciers, pollen grains from the surrounding foliage settles in the depth of the bodies of fresh water, neatly separated into a readable layers by dark bands of rainy seasons, runoff and the light seams of dry season algal blossoms. At ancient Lake Tanganyika, the core reveal more than the identities of the plants. They show how a jungle gradually turned to a fire tolerant. The broad leafed woodlands now is a mayombo, which covers vast swatches of today's Africa. Mayombo is another man-made artifact which developed a philothetic human discovering that by burning trees that could create a grassland and the open woodlands to attract a nurture antipole. Mixed with thickening layers of a charcoal, the pollen shows the even greater deforestation that accompanied the dawning of the Iron Age. As humans learned first to smelt ore, then to fashion hoes for their furrows. There they planted crops such as ginger millets, whose signature also appears. Later arrivals like beans and the corns produce either two pollen or grains, too large to a drift fair. But the spreads of the agriculture is evident by the increases of the pollens from the ferns that colonize the distributed lands. All this and the more we learn for mud covered with 10 meters of the steel pipe lowered on a cable and aided by a vibrating motor, driven by the force of its own weight into the lake bed and into 100,000 years of pollen layers. Our next steps, says the University of Arizona paleontologist Andy Cohen, who heads a research project in Kajamo, Tanzania on the lake eastern shore, is a drill rig capable of penetrating a 5 million or even 10 million year core. Such as a machine would be very expensive, on the order of a small drilling barge. The lake is so deep that drills could not be anchored. Recoiled thrusters linked to the global poisoning system to the constantly adjust its positions above the hole. But it would be worth it, says Cohen, because it is the Earth's longest, richest climate archives. It's long been assumed that the climate is driven by advancing and trending polar ice sheets. But there is a good reason to believe that the circulation at the tropics is also involved. We knew a lot about the climate changes at the poles, but not on the heat engines of the planet where people live. Coring it, Cohen says that would capture 10 times the climate history found in the glaciers and with far greater precisions. There are probably 100 different things we can analyze. Among them is the history of human evolution, because the core records would span the year during which primates took their first pedal steps and proceed through the transgenderous stages that led to migrating from Australian Australopithecus to Homo habilis, and finally sapiens. The pollens would be the same that our ancestors inhaled, even broadcast from the same plant they touched and ate, because they too emerged from the rift. East of the lake, in this African rift, parallel branches, another lake shallower, and the sea lane evaporated and reappeared various times over the past 2 million years. Today it is grassland, hard grassed by the cows and the goats of massy herdsmen. Overlying the sandstone, clay, tuff, and the ash atop of a bed of volcanic basalts. A stream draining Tanzania volcanic highlights to the east gradually cut a gorge through those layers 100 meters deep. There, during the 12th century, archaeologists Louis and Mary Leakey discovered the fossils hominoid skulls left 1750 million years. The grey rubble of a Olduvia gorge, now a sedimentary bristling in Sicily, eventually yielded hundreds of the stone flakes, tools, and the chopper cores made for underlying the basalts. Some of these has been dated to 2 million years ago. In 1978, 25 miles southwest of Olduvia Gorge, Mary Leakey Stream found a trail of footprints frozen in wet ash. They were made by an trio, likely parents and a child, walking on a fleeing through the rainy aftermath of an eruption of the nearby Sidon volcano. Their discovery pushed that bipedal hominid existed back beyond 3.5 million years ago. From here, and from related sites in Kenya and Ethiopia, a pattern emerges of a gestation of the human race. It is now known that we walked on 2 feet for the hundreds of thousands of the years before it occurred to us to strike one stone against another to create a sharp-edged tools. From that remains of homemade teeth and others nearby fossils. We know we are omnivorous, equipped with morals to crunch nuts. But also, as we advanced from finding stones shaped like axes to learning how to procedure them, possessed of the means to efficiently kill and eat animals.